Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everyone's had a good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank you so much for coming here today. I'd also like to thank Professor Cohn for taking the time to come and talk to us about national security and torture. I'd like to have a show of hands. Who here has a cell phone in their possession? I'm surprised not everyone has a cell phone. I'm glad everyone's a phone call away. Now please shut it off immediately. I'd like to talk to you and introduce Professor Marjorie Cohen. She is a professor at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law. She has gone in front of Congress on Bush administration's policy on interrogation. She's a former president of the National Lawyers Guild. She's co-authored these several books, amongst which 3 of them are here displayed, which will be available for purchasing and signing after the talk. And she's received a Peace Scholar Award in 2008 from the Peace and Justice Association. I'd also like to introduce Sam Nejabat, who I've known since high school. Since then, he's graduated from UC Berkeley, majoring in political science. He's been proactive on campus in coalition groups and human rights organizations. He's worked in Senator Boxer's office, advocating human rights, and also interned in Washington, D.C. in a lobbying firm for human rights. He will be talking to you today about his organization that recently started called Campainging Human Rights. And then shortly afterwards, Professor Cohen will be talking to you about national security and torture. So let me pass the torch to Sam, who will be talking to you about campaigning human rights.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Professor Cohen, again, for coming out today and giving us your insights on this very timely topic. Thank you, Mr. De La Fuente, for the introduction. And most of all, thank you all for coming to our event. My name is Sam Nejabat, and I founded this nonprofit organization called Campaigning Human Rights. And my goal is to raise awareness through social media, events like such, and teaming up with prominent advocates, such as Professor Cohen, to promote this very important cause. Ultimately, by partnering up with such experts and other organizations, we will be able to tackle human rights issues and violations, one by one, and gradually contribute to the hope of decreasing human rights abuses worldwide. My interest in human rights was initially sparked when growing up. I heard firsthand accounts of experiences my parents had in Iran. Eventually, after numerous struggles, my parents migrated to the United States after the 1979 revolution. Unfortunately, 33 years later, human rights violations are still prevalent there, especially with minority groups. Having said that, it is very imperative that we are cognizant of the fact that human rights abuses do not occur only by countries in the developing world, but also right here at home in the United States. A prime example of this was the abuses of Abu Ghraib. Human rights violations occur in various environments and to varying degrees across the world. By collectively working together and raising greater awareness, and more importantly, taking initiative to ensure we play our part, we can mitigate these violations. At this point, I'd like to invite Professor Cohen to share her valuable insight on these violations and go ahead and give the lecture. Professor?
Thank you, Sam, and thank you for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Has anybody heard me speak here before? Okay, a couple of people, 3 people, right. I haven't been here for a while, but I've been here before, so if I repeat myself, not too many people will recognize it. No, I'm actually going to bring it right up to date, but anyway, I'm delighted to be here and grateful for this opportunity. I want to start by quoting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who delivered the keynote address at the 1967 convention of the American Psychological Association 7 months before he was assassinated. And the topic of his entire speech was the role of the behavioral scientist in the civil rights movement. So I'm just going to read a brief excerpt from Dr. Martin Luther King's speech. There are certain technical words in every academic discipline which soon become stereotypes and even cliches. Every academic discipline has its technical nomenclature. You who are in the field of psychology have given us a great word. It is the word maladjusted. This word is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is a good word. Certainly, it is good that in dealing with what the word implies, you are declaring that destructive maladjustment should be destroyed. You are saying that all must seek the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But on the other hand, I am sure that we will recognize that there are some things in our society, some things in our world to which we should never be adjusted. There are some things concerning which we must always be maladjusted if we are to be people of goodwill. We must never adjust ourselves to racial discrimination and racial segregation. We must never adjust ourselves to religious bigotry. We must never adjust ourselves to economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. We must never adjust ourselves to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. And I'm confident that if Dr. King were with us today, he would say we must never adjust ourselves to torture. Torture and abuse are illegal, immoral, ineffective, and unwise. The United States has always prohibited the use of torture in our Constitution, our laws, executive statements, and judicial decisions. We have ratified 3 treaties that all outlaw torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. When the United States ratifies a treaty, it becomes part of U.S. law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. One of those treaties is called the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. And that treaty says, and I quote, "No exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war or a threat of war, internal political instability, or any other public emergency may be invoked as a justification for torture. Whether someone is a prisoner of war or not, he must always be treated humanely. There are no gaps in the Geneva Conventions, another treaty that we've ratified. We have federal laws that criminalize torture, federal statutes, the War Crimes Act, the Torture Statute, and the U.S. Army Field Manual also outlaws torture and abuse. Now, the Constitution gives Congress the power to make the laws, and the President the duty to carry them out. Yet on
I have a question. In your professional opinion, how do you see the human violations? How can we bring them to light nowadays? I mean, there's a high visibility of all the human rights violations going on, but what about all the ones we don't hear of? How can we bring those to light into media and have
what we need to do is to educate ourselves. Okay, the question was, how can we bring human rights violations to light, especially ones that we don't hear about? We're not going to hear about most of them in the corporate media. The ones we do hear about are going to come out in the alternative media, such as blogs that I and others write on, and radio shows and organizations like SAMS. So it's really important that we educate ourselves, because then we can spread the word. And then, once we educate ourselves, we've got to speak out. That means get together, hold demonstrations, write letters to the editor, write op-eds, call your congressman, email your congressman, write your congressman. They do respond to pressure. So my feeling is that people should act where they are. Do what you can. And if we all do that, then this is going to come to light.
Can we have a round of applause for
Justice to prevent future human rights violations. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? The time is now, ladies and gentlemen. Now please visit our website, campainginghumanrights.org, and like our Facebook page. Also visit Professor Cohen's website. If you haven't already done so, there's a sign-up sheet, and shortly afterwards we'll be selling, you'll be able to purchase and sign Professor Cohen's books that are on display right here. So thank you so much for coming here today.
Marjorie Kahn, professor.
Yes.
So do you think the democratic governments in the Middle East will prevent human rights violations?
The democratic government in the Middle East?
In the Middle East?
The jury is out on that. I know in Egypt, it was an incredible thing that took place there. But there's still struggle going on about who's in charge and who's doing what, and who's committing human rights violations. So it's a little bit early to tell. And again, you gotta look at country by country, because the Middle East is a huge area, and some countries are certainly less democratic than others, I should say.
What do you say is an alternative solution to interrogation techniques of prisoners who are thought to have valuable information?
As I said, I think that they need to be treated kindly. They need to be treated with respect. And that we get much more valuable information that way. One of the things to keep in mind, though, is that of the some 800 men and boys who have been held at Guantanamo since January of 2002, most of them are innocent of any terrorism-related relationship. And many of them were picked up by warlords in Afghanistan or Pakistan and sold maybe to the Northern Alliance or to the U.S. military for $3,000, $5,000 bounty, and just rounded up. Many of them are there by mistake. The U.S. government admits that. And yet, the Guantanamo is still open, and many of them have still not been sent to other countries. Now, Obama did say, after he was inaugurated, that he wanted to close Guantanamo. He tried to do that. Congress said no, and they used it as a political football and said, we won't fund it. You can't send anybody to the United States. You can't send anybody unless we approve it. And they had at Guantanamo what were called combatant status review tribunals, which were kangaroo courts. They weren't really courts, but they were administrative proceedings to decide whether somebody was an enemy combatant and whether they should be held for another year. And most people were held to be enemy combatants. When one of those combatant status review tribunals decided, for example, that they weren't enemy combatants, the military told them to go back and do it again and do it again and do it again until they did find that they were enemy combatants. They weren't allowed to have a lawyer, just a personal representative who wasn't a lawyer. It was a military person an officer who in many times argued against the detainee and in favor of the government. And the Supreme Court was very concerned about that.